Welcome back, Camden Catholic. So today we were talking about in class, we talked about the founding myth of Rome. Like, we'll go in reverse, right? We talked about the founding myth of Rome. We talked about the early settlers a little tiny bit, right? We discussed the geography of Italy and its major differences between Greece. We talked about how the land was much more traversable on land, but how they didn't have a lot of natural harbors, so trade with other cultures actually was pretty tough because the Greeks had taken the natural harbors down in Sicily, etc., etc., etc. So, but let's keep going, all right? Talk about the first real founders of Rome, right? So the first real founders were called the Latins, right? Oh, go figure. I wonder what language they spoke. Boom, Latin. Now, two of my classes, not my fourth period, but my fourth period should write this down because then you'll understand a little bit better and remind me to explain it to y'all tomorrow because I forgot because I was using my marker and stuff, and y'all know I love my new whiteboard. So, anyway, how many, really quick, how many language roots are there that exist in history? Good job, Jaden. That is exactly right. There are four, right? And Latin happens to be one of them, all right? Because the Indo-Europeans spoke four different branches of languages, including Latin, Germanic, Slavic, and the other one that I can't remember. So I'll look it up for you later on. But, yeah, so the Latins actually were some of the first settlers of Rome. And, of course, they wanted to settle Italy because it's great land, very fertile. And also, they set up these really, really ugly little houses, right? So, early on when the Latins settled the Italian peninsula, they had these really, really nasty-looking little huts, right? And so, they were very simple people. Very, like, first Neolithic version kind of people, not really, like, crazy intricate, not a lot of real customs that we really know of other than, like, their language roots, right? So, continuing forward, though, a small group of them is going to break away from the Latins, and they're going to found what is now called Rome, all right? And they called themselves Romans, all right? So they set up their own little city-state that was unique to them, calling their land Rome, okay? Now, so the next people are going to come into play, all right? Well, first of all, something you need to understand is that Rome was founded on the hills overlooking what is called the Tiber River, right? The Tiber River. I'm going to show you a picture of it in about 2 seconds, okay? So it was founded on a hill overlooking the Tiber River. The settlement, though, is going to grow. Circle it, highlight it, underline it, star it, whatever you got to do. It's going to grow and expand to cover 7 hills, okay? Now, some of y'all probably know that already because when we talked about the founding myth of Romulus Remus, that their settlement actually grew to be, spread over 7 hills, and then Romulus stabs Remus because he wants to be the first true king of Rome, right? So anyway, and then Romulus, Rome, etc. Lupe, Wolf, So anyway, but let's keep going though. So it was actually founded on a hill not because of like eagles circling like the prophecy foretold them. It was actually founded on a hill because it was to protect from floods, right? And the Tiber River... Ooh, that's a good question, right? It's a very good question. I really got to think about who I should be asking this to. I don't know. Let's ask, let me think. I'm trying to think. Let's ask Taj, right? Taj, why was it so important for the Tiber River to flood? Good job, right? Because the floods were very beneficial for them because it left behind mineral-rich silt, right? Silt rejuvenated the soil. They needed it. It's good stuff, okay? So it was to protect from floods, so why they settled up on top of the hill. So this is actually the map of 1st century BC Rome when they had finally set up, right? You've got this hill, this hill, then that hill, Palatine Hill, Aventine Hill, and then Capitoline Hill is around here somewhere as well. So anyway, but then this is going to be their early setup on top of 7 separate hills, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, anyway. They also set up road infrastructures and things like that. We'll talk about that later on. Whoops. Let me back up. Oh, wait, too far. All right, anyway. But nearby... the Etruscans were another group of people, okay? So here's the really, really unique thing. The Etruscans and the Latins had both set up civilizations in Italy about 3 years apart from each other, all right? So the Etruscans showed up in 753 BC, and then the Latins, actually, or the Romans, broke off in 750 BC. So a very short time span. 3 years is nothing when we talk about thousands of years worth of history. So it's actually very, very unique and a very important time understanding that we get that they were very close by, right? But continuing forward, so that right there is the Tiber River, and it's a picture that I took while I was in Rome. All right, anyway, very, very cool. But this actually was during November, and as you can see, during the winter months, the river gets very, very large, and it swells a lot, right? So, and this is my wife doing a handstand on one of the on Capitoline Hill, all right? Capitoline Hill right next to the Forum in Rome, okay? Now, and then again, like I said, that's the original map. Now, let's keep going, though. So the Etruscans are going to be the people that show up, okay? They created city-states to the north of Rome, right? Right around like Tuscany, where Florence is today. That was their first city-state developments. So they traded with the Greeks and shared a ton of their culture. So Etruscans actually, a lot of very similar habits, a lot of very similar setups, a lot of their city-states mirrored a lot of what Greece actually looked like. For example, we know that Pericles built a wall around Athens. The Etruscans were the first people to come up with the ideas of building a wall around their cities to keep out anything negative or unclean or impure, right? Keep it out of our city. And the Romans are going to do the same thing when they establish Rome. So the early on Etruscans had a lot of dealings with the Latins. They came up with the walls around Rome, and they ruled over Rome. Actually, they're going to... Taking over by force is a hard way of explaining this. But the Etruscans actually had a small freestanding military. So they brought Rome into their rule and protected Rome from the outside, kind of trading their allegiance, okay, instead of money. Now, they ruled over Rome from 753 to 509 BC, okay? They ruled over from 753 to 509 BC. So the Etruscans will have rule over the Romans eventually. And then the Romans are eventually going to break away because they want their independence. So the Romans are going to expel the Etruscans and become their own state in 509 BC, okay? And as you can tell already, 509 BC, we're actually getting pretty close to like the birth of Christ and things like that, right? We actually are, because Rome didn't last as long as everybody likes to believe it does. It actually, the eastern half lasted for a really long time, but the western half actually fell in 476, actually making them a civilization that's less than 1,000 years old. That's pitiful when you're talking about the ancient stuff, right? So can you imagine that one day, like, America will be 1,000 years old? Who knew? Anyway, now, hopefully it will be anyway. But even though most things they did were Etruscan things, right? So the Romans took a lot of things from the Etruscans, and most of the things that they did that was kind of defines them as Roman people were Etruscan. So this, for example, right here, they wore togas, much like the Etruscans did. This right here is the Etruscan alphabet that was developed off the Greek alphabet and then would become the Roman alphabet. Roman numerals were Etruscan. Also, this thing is actually really, really cool. This is called a fasces, all right? Fasces. So the Etruscans, whenever the king would be walking with them, they would carry this as a symbol of his power and his ability to kill anyone he wanted to if they actually revolted against him. It's called a fasces. It's an axe inside of a bundle of wooden rods, all right? So as time goes by, that symbol of the fasces is going to also be used by the Romans to implicate their emperor, right? Like, oh, bam, our emperor. Boom! This is the symbol of him, okay? This big fasces, okay? It's a big weapon. I like it a lot. I think it's very, very cool. So, keep going, though. Roman conquest of Italy. The Romans are going to also successfully take over the entire Italian peninsula. They are going to also fight several small wars, conquering small areas around their original settlement. All right? Now, Cincinnatus is a very good story about how this all went down. So Cincinnatus was the first dictator of Rome. Do not get this confused. He's the first dictator of Rome. So Rome was really unique, and remember this. You can write it down if you want to, but we will talk about it again later on as well. A dictator was only brought in during a time of war. And apparently Cincinnatus, he's right here. Cincinnatus, oh, yep, see anything in common, see anything in common? Oh, yep, there's the faces right there. Told you, I'm so smart. All right, anyway, now, so Cincinnatus and the Achae people, or Achae, or Achae, all right, so, or however you say it, Cincinnatus was actually farming his crops north of Rome, and the Achae people were threatening to invade, and they actually had a small war with them, right? So they went to Cincinnatus, and they were like, we need a general, we need a dictator. Lead our armies. Apparently Cincinnatus wiped his brow, grabbed his equipment and his weapons, and then led Rome to victory in a very short war, protecting themselves from an outside invasion. So Cincinnatus became the example of what a dictator should be, because 15 days later, he stepped down and then turned the rule back over to the Senate. All right, so it's a very cool thing. Just remember, Cincinnatus. He's also the reason why we call Cincinnati, Cincinnati. Ha 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 ha. Tell me that history ain't relevant. All right, anyway, now, so, moving on, though, then there's going to be a big problem. So, you know, Rome's riding high. They're winning small wars. They're expanding. They're taking over people nearby, and those pesky Samnites and stuff like that. We'll talk about them later on tomorrow. So, then the Gauls are going to invade, okay? The Gauls invaded, really quick, the Gauls, also known as the Celts, all right, C-E-L-T-S, they're going to invade, and they're going to completely sack Rome, all right? They sacked it. And when you say sacked actually means to completely destroy it. Basically burn it to the ground. Now, really quickly, write this down. This is the one thing I'm checking for tomorrow, so you should make sure you have this. The Gauls did not want to take over Rome. They wanted to loot and burn Rome, all right? Looting is when you steal, right? The Gauls had no want over their land. They didn't want their land. They had their own land, right? So the Celts, they're eventually going to like settle Ireland much later on. But the Gauls were a Roman group of what they called barbarians because they couldn't understand what they were saying. But a Gaul warrior was dressed much like this, okay? So carried heavy iron weapons, carried heavy wooden shields, used armor, used chainmail, things like that. Things the Romans were not prepared for and had never seen. So they had no problem completely destroying Rome and killing most of its people. There's only one reason why they didn't kill everybody. But I'll tell you that story tomorrow. All right, so we are starting off class with a great story about how the Gauls, like how the Romans convinced the Gauls to keep their city somewhat alive, and why Rome is going to take that as a measure of we will never be conquered ever again, right? So, boom. There you go. That's early Roman settlement stuff, right? So we're going to keep talking about this. We're going to talk about how Rome's going to grow and keep growing and growing and growing, get bigger and bigger and bigger and better and better and better. We're going to talk about the city setup, and I'll show you some pictures from my trip, and I'm going to show you some really cool stuff. But I can't wait to see y'all then, Camden Catholic. I hope y'all have a great evening. Enjoy yourself.